Hello and welcome to the Cybersecurity Houston series. Cyber Houston is a collaborative initiative focused on building a more cyber resilient Houston by bringing together experts like mi amigo John and mi amigo Pierluigi, business leaders, and the community. This series is your go-to resources for practical insights on cybersecurity, resilience, and risk in today's digital world. Good morning, guys. How are you doing?
Good
Good
morning.
morning. I'm
Very good.
traveling and in a terrible place, so I apologize for the poor lighting. We'll
You,
power through.
you look great, John. You look great, John. Okay, so today's subject for the public is something I picked, so you guys will suffer me, which is vulnerability management program. And for that, I would like to use one single slide so we can start explaining what is a vulnerability, because sometimes we get confused about what that is. So if Reva doesn't mind, let's push that there. Okay, so I really like this drawing because sometimes people confuse, what is a vulnerability versus a threat versus an attacker versus an exploit. So a vulnerability is something like you can see in this easy drawing, which is your door that is an unsupervised with no control when someone can get in, right? So as you can see in this case, you have this police officer which is controlling this door, so the threats probably will not be able to pass because you have some type of control that the police officer will be able to stop. Your vulnerability are your misconfigurations, the bugs in software, your default configurations that at the end no one is being able to control, and at the end the attacker through an exploit is able to kind of breach. That's what the vulnerability normally refers to. There's a lot of confusion between, what sometimes we refer to the patching process and the vulnerability management process. It's very important that we understand that what we will be talking today is much more about vulnerability management, which is not only patching. It's about making sure that those vulnerabilities that your environment may have are going to be controlled. So when we talk about this program, it's about making sure that you have a process in place that is going to be able to, first of all, discover what your vulnerabilities are. Second, have a very good idea of your priorities, and then being able to remediate those vulnerabilities. That's not only patching. Misconfiguration is a very normal vulnerability that we see when you have an unsecure protocol, for example, in your network that is running and you should not have. And at the end, that patching process will not be able to remediate. So that is in a very short version what the vulnerability management program is. John Pierluigi, anything to add to the definition of what is a vulnerability management program?
I can add maybe 2 minutes. So in early 2000, the Carnegie University did a study of code programming, and they found that an average programmer makes an error every 50 lines of code. They also found that Linux has less vulnerabilities, about one every 100 lines of code. And I'm sorry, somebody can sue me for this, but Microsoft was the worst, with more than a line for 50 lines of code, an error for 50 lines of code. Now, not every error leads to a tragedy. Errors are errors. Unfortunately, some errors lead to something that is a vulnerability, which means something that could potentially be attacked to take down the software or to do other things. On top of that, not all vulnerabilities are exploitable, right? Some of them might only be exploitable if you have access to the core hardware of the system, for example, or other similar circumstances, right? Otherwise, we'd be toast. Okay, if we had an exploitable vulnerability for every 50 lines of code, we could not work. Right? Luckily, that's not the case. It's a lot less. Right? But it is the main reason for vulnerabilities. Right? You can misconfigure, you can open ports, you can open protocols or whatever you want, but the core element of why we talk about vulnerabilities and the origin of the word is because we're humans, we make mistakes, and those mistakes eventually, some of them, lead to an exploitable vulnerability. that can be used by hackers to attack your computers remotely. Okay. Does that mean that it's all there? No. Andres was correct in saying that we can create our own vulnerabilities, right? By configuring the systems incorrectly, open ports that shouldn't be open, and installing protocols and programs and other things that shouldn't be there. And so we can make our life worse sometimes.
100%. Thank you, Pierluigi. That was very good. John, anything to add to the what?
I do. I have some thoughts on that. When you showed the slide on exploits, threats, vulnerabilities, etc., when we talk about a vulnerability management program, and I'll talk about this in more detail when we transition to my section, the sheer volume of vulnerabilities that we see when we start measuring them can feel a little bit overwhelming. And what Pierluigi just touched on is that not all vulnerabilities are created equal. Some are more impactful than others. And that ties back to Andy's slide of risk, vulnerability, exploit, threat, because there is an equation. And that equation for risk, people talk about risk a lot, and it's really a simple mathematical equation. What is the likelihood that something bad is going to happen, the threat? And if something bad does manifest, what's the impact in our environment? How bad can it be? So risk is oftentimes shown as the threat times the vulnerability. And the importance of a vulnerability management program is highlighted by the fact that we can literally do very little to reduce threat. We cannot stop somebody who's intent on hacking from hacking. That's the threat. We don't have any influence over the threat. What we have influence over is how do we control the vulnerabilities, the impact of the vulnerability, thereby reducing overall risk. So if it's a mathematical operation, risk equals threat times vulnerability, and we can't impact threat, that makes the vulnerability management program that much more important.
Thank you, John. And while I have you with the microphone, and you already kind of starting the conversation, because we had kind of this is for the public to know, we kind of battle if we introduce this subject to the leaders, because this is targeted to leaders and business owners. So why are we doing kind of a video on vulnerability management? Why is this important to business owners and leaders?
Well, I think so. First of all, it's important. The importance can't be understated. We don't want to be breached, and we know that attackers use the exploitation of vulnerabilities to breach companies and to breach organizations in those networks. And breaches lead to ransomware. Breaches lead to corporate account takeover. Breaches lead to business email compromise, the sum of which totals billions and billions of dollars every single year. So to me, vulnerability management is the prevention piece. And this is truly a case. If anyone's lived through a breach and breach response and the pain and suffering that it entails, you really will understand that an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure at that point. And I really feel that vulnerability management kind of fits that bill. Most breaches don't begin with Hollywood hacking. It's not some, person like Mr. Robot who's hacking into these organizations with wild techniques, etc. Attackers use well-known playbooks. They do what works for them. And if you look at an analysis of hundreds and hundreds of breaches that was done by the Secret Service and Verizon, it's a great report. It's issued annually. And the 2025 Verizon Data Breach and Investigation Report lets us know that exploitation of vulnerabilities is the second most impactful initial access vector that exists. Number one is credential abuse. But number two, 20% of all those attacks use the exploitation of vulnerabilities as that initial access vector. So this is incredibly important.
Explain a little bit what is initial access vector to our non-technical public.
Sure. So the attacker's on the outside, and we operate networks, and our data and our systems are on the inside. Now, it could be the inside of a cloud. You could have systems inside of a cloud or systems inside of your own network, but there is an inside and there is an outside. And the attackers are outside, and they want to get inside. and they use different techniques. They might use a phishing attack, other types of social engineering. They might fool somebody into giving away their username and password. So now they simply log in with a username and password that works into, let's say, Azure, Google Cloud, AWS. That's a credential attack. But we have infrastructure in all of our environments that's accessible from the internet. We have VPNs, we have firewalls, and those form boundaries between our private networks and the internet. And if an attacker can exploit a vulnerability in one of those internet-facing assets, that is the initial attack vector. And I know I mentioned that this vector is the second most popular and impactful for attackers. If we look at just the VPN side or the firewall side, if we look at the threat report from 2024 versus 2025, there's an 8 times increase of exploitation of those firewall and VPN devices. And overall, simply just exploitation of vulnerabilities, that number went up 30% from last year. So what do we know? We know that adversaries love exploiting vulnerabilities to break into networks. It's becoming increasingly more popular year over year. And there's a very high focus on firewalls and VPN type endpoints. Furthermore, we know that that 8-fold increase, just over half of companies are able to successfully patch those internet-facing VPNs and firewalls. And typically it takes them 32 days on average to get the patch deployed. So these are all things that, if I own a business, if I run a business, I now know, hey, I've got to patch my stuff. I need to focus on internet-facing systems first, and the rest of the world around me struggles to do it well. I want to be better than them.
That's very important, and this is related to what Pierluigi was saying something before.
Yes.
Is not every vulnerability has the same weight when we talk about risk. If you have external facing systems, software, equipment, anything that comes from your reports in the vulnerability management side, you should prioritize those versus the one that comes on the inside. It doesn't mean that internal ones are not important, but those are the ones that they can use, as John was explained, pretty easy for these people to get you hacked. Sorry, Pierre, you want to say something?
No, I'm just agreeing with you. Very often when I talk to people about vulnerabilities, all they think about is the patch management on the workstations, right? And there's so much more to it, right? We are touching on various aspects. For example, nobody ever thinks about secondary devices, cameras, heck, refrigerators. My refrigerator is connected to the internet, and if you're in a company, you got a refrigerator, and somebody plugs it in because they want to see the Ring camera at the door of your company. You just created a vulnerability. Right? Certain things are okay at home, right? But when you do it in an office, when you do it inside the network, you got to be very careful. Right? And yes, these devices today auto-update, self-update all the time, and that's fine, whatever, right? But still, the focus needs to shift, right? It needs to be a little wider. Which, by the way, this is a very long conversation probably, because we're also often talking about how do you find the vulnerabilities? What do you do, right? What do you do? They install a scanner and they start scanning. And scanning means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. Because when you scan a network, last week I had a case of a client reporting to us supposedly an SSH vulnerability. And then when I go look, there was no SSH running. There is no SSH daemon running. There is no possibility of an SSH vulnerability being found by a scanner. God knows what the scanner is found and it's reporting. They report a lot of false positives. They report also a lot of things that are meaningless, right? So I'm going to say something that's probably unrelated to this call, but it's very important. We waste an enormous amount of money in constant scanning. Today, it's become very popular to do real-time scanning, but nobody ever wants to spend the money to do a real penetration testing. We call it pen testing for fancy, and we delude ourselves that we're doing penetration testing. We're not. Okay, we have a scanner. that pretends to look for vulnerabilities.
Okay,
Literally say pretends.
but I like to interject here because you're talking about two subsets that there's
Yeah, I know, but they're important because they're very related. What are you looking for?
100%. But
Right?
I want your help here because this is something I battle a lot, and I'm sure John has the same problem as you too. So can you tell us what is the difference between a vulnerability management assessment and a penetration testing?
Yeah, I was going to get it there. So a penetration testing is supposed to be a person that doesn't know anything about your network. Actually, in this case, you may give him the advantage of telling him some things about your network so that he doesn't charge you too much in the discovery phase, right? And then proceeds to systematically attempt to attack your network from inside or from outside. If you want to go any further, we also call it the red team, blue team, and disruptive security, whatever. There are a lot of terms that we use here, right? Adversarial attacks, where they actually go further and they start calling your people and socially engineering themselves into your network. But that's a bit too much, maybe, for this conversation, because they're going beyond the practical vulnerabilities. Now they're going into the vulnerabilities of the people, which is a different subject altogether. But at least a penetration tester will sit at his desk wherever he is in the world and will try to exploit those vulnerabilities to actually get in. And we'll try to highlight the ones, maybe the 2 or 3, maybe the one that is the one that could let hackers into your network. So you are chasing your tail, patch managing and scanning networks all the time, and then patching things that would never be used by a hacker, and you never had done a real penetration testing where somebody's told you that particular situation there is the one that's going to get you, right? This is very important. And in the aspect of patch management, we do automatic patching. In some situations, we have systems that cannot be patched because they're legacy systems. Mm-hmm. And I have a lot of examples that I've seen through the years of this. And then in that case, we put devices in front of these systems to protect them in a different way. For example, you might have a website that is written in a very old PHP. You just can't update it because you break it because of incompatibilities. Then you put a WAF in front of a website. You should always do that. But in this case, it's particularly important that you do that. So there are technologies, there are methods to patch, right? And patch doesn't always mean installing the new software. Sometimes it means installing a WAF to protect your web server, okay? It's a different way of managing your vulnerability. But very rarely do I see clients wanting to spend the money to actually test. Once you're done all this, you've patched your refrigerator, you've patched your systems, you think you've closed all the ports, you have your firewall with the latest software, and so on and so forth. Are we safe? What is my risk now? Right? You don't know until you truly get somebody really experienced to do an adversarial attack to your network. Not one that will take your network down, but one that will actually show you the vulnerability.
Let's put a pause because John wants to talk for some minutes, and we'll let him put an opinion here. What do you think, John, here?
Well, I think it highlights the fact that we often talk about defense in depth. We talk about layered security controls. And Pierluigi's right. We can't over-rely on any single facet of an information security program to holistically protect our environments. And today, that's a huge topic, though. So with today's topic of vulnerability management, what we've really done is we've recognized the success that attackers have in breaching networks by the exploitation of vulnerabilities. So we're addressing that and talking about a vulnerability management program. And a program really begins with an understanding that we're trying to burn down business risk. This is not an IT problem. It's not a technology problem per se. This is a component of our enterprise risk, and we need to measure it and understand it. And then we take action against it. So we all have a different comfort zone when it comes to how much technology risk are we willing to accept in our environment? And we know that if we start, Pierluigi talked about scanning. So there's a number of techniques to scan the environment for missing patches, weak configurations, misconfigurations, etc. You can buy an actual scanning device, you deploy it in the network, and it reaches out and it touches your different endpoints, and it has awareness of common vulnerabilities, common exploitations, common misconfigurations. It knows what software is up to date, what software is out of date, etc. And we get all that. So that's kind of like the starting point is how do we identify and measure? And now we have this volume that can be staggering. I mean, I'm talking you deploy a vulnerability scanning capability inside of even a small size network, you're going to have tens of thousands of vulnerabilities. And that's going to throw somebody back on their heels and be like, well, where do I start? What do I do? Where do I begin? So first and foremost, don't freak out because we've all been there and you're not alone. And what we have to do is we have to ask ourselves, what do I pay attention to and why do I pay attention to it? So we prioritize and group and filter, and then we go fix things. We can't afford to fix everything. So we have to fix the things that matter. And in my opinion, what matters most for starters is what vulnerabilities do I have on devices that are accessible from the internet? I want to know what the attacker can see. And I want to fix that first. Then I start looking at my internal systems, which are inside of the perimeter. And I want to know, well, do I have any are known exploits available for these vulnerabilities? I don't want to live with that condition. So I'm going to put some pressure on IT to patch those types of vulnerabilities first. And I want to get back to internet-facing assets. So the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, they actually offer free tools and services from a scanning perspective. So if you go to CISA.gov as a resource and look for some of their cyber hygiene services, you may qualify to have a trusted, known federal entity scan your internet-facing assets and provide you with reports on your resiliency. But so, from a program perspective, once we've prioritized, you want to put some pressure against IT to start patching these things. The question, you don't have to be technical to burn down risk. What type of vulnerabilities exist in my environment? And how bad could they be? So is authentication to the system required before they can exploit any type of a vulnerability? If I have one system that's vulnerable to one bad application, and that application never touches sensitive information, it's much different than if I have a vulnerability on a VPN endpoint that's accessible from the internet, and it can be exploited with no authentication required, and the adversary can run any code of their choice or take any action of their choosing. I mean, that's a bad day.
Allow me to interrupt. There is nothing on a network, in my opinion, that cannot touch other things unless now we go into a different but related topic, which is segmentation. A network is better protected when it is properly designed to segment the data and the access to the data and the data flow and the functions of the network without overcomplicating things, right? But if you have the system that is vulnerable, for you to say the system never touches data, that means the system has been segmented off the network in a way that has a firewall or whatever else, something and make sure that if I actually exploit the system, log on to the system somehow, own it, now I don't see the rest of the network. Because even if the system per se is not designed to touch other parts of the network, if it's a Windows workstation or server and I am able to, because of the application, exploit the system, get on it, get a login, get a foothold on it, and then now I see the network, then it doesn't matter that the system itself didn't have authorization to touch It's on the network. So we need to also think of proper design of the network, which to me is always very important. You need to understand the basic networking to be able to defend yourself from
Yeah, but that's what John was saying in Defense in Depth, right? So this is not these things don't work alone. You have this.
Exactly.
You have to.
None of this works alone.
They need to be in collaboration, and with that, we don't have a lot of time. So let me quickly ask you, Pierluigi, now again that you have the microphone.
Sorry, John,
What recommendations and best practice can you share? That you can tell. Okay, now that you know what it is, now that you know what is important, what recommendations you want to give to kind of these people?
I think John was on a very good track there already with internal and external, right? So first of all, the obvious, whatever can be patched, patch it, because the best protection is always to have, if somebody's already found the vulnerability, they've already created the software to fix it, install it if you can, right? So now you take away 90% of your problems because you are patching properly everything, not only the workstations though, please, everything on a network, even a printer, right? Nobody ever thinks of these secondary devices. Everything on a network, if there is a patch, install it, right? And if you think that the patch is going to break something that's running on the system, then find a way to either update the system. Sometimes it's not as easy, sometimes it's not as immediate. And so in that case, segment the system off the network in a place where if it gets exploited, it cannot cause too much damage. Heck, even with a separate firewall inside the network, just put it somewhere else, right? And just try to, and by the way, as we are talking segmentation, the reason why we segment our networks is especially for the reason is to limit the risk. We have been talking about risk from the beginning. If one segment somehow gets attacked, a proper segmentation guarantees that they can get everywhere. They can at least not very easily get everywhere else, right? You are going to have systems inside the network, which is too late to talk about now, but maybe we'll have another session about this, like an EDR, MDR, that may monitor this movement, this attempted movement across the network. If the network is properly segmented and the systems will reveal the attempt, then you can do something about taking them away, stopping the attack, right? So, but again, to John's point, the vulnerabilities of everything that's exposed to the internet are by far the most important. And what is exposed to the internet?
Thank you.
Your websites for the most part, but not only, right?
Thank you.
For the most part, websites.
So I would like to add one more thing, and then I will give you the microphone back to Pierluigi. So to me is, what is a vulnerability now? Why is important to you? Your next step will be identify, through an assessment process, prioritize your remediation, and then of course remediate. Those are kind of the three key things as a follow-up. And with that, John, I don't know if you have anything to add in the next 30 seconds. If not, we will close.
Yeah, well, what you just said is a lather, rinse, repeat process, because new vulnerabilities, like 5 of them just happened right now while we were on this call. And so if you view vulnerabilities as a big pile, man, those vulns just keep dumping on top of the pile. What we want to do is shovel them off faster than they collect. It's something... Hey, go start a vulnerability management program. Really easy to say, very hard to do. So there's a lot of things that are say easy, do hard. But what's interesting about the 3 of us is that we do have those practical experiences, and the forum that we're here in is really designed to share these practical stories, insights, strategies, and takeaways, not only now but in the weeks ahead. And I would certainly invite everybody to follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, and at cyberhouston.org for our upcoming episodes and some different resources that we share with the community. So thank you all for joining us. Together, we're working to build a more resilient Cyber Houston. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Special thanks to Renica Digital, our sponsor of today's show.